Hi there. I'm just gonna go ahead and rip the band-aid off right now. Cryo. Cryo is the worst. It's probably the first one I'm gonna talk about. Cryo has not been good for a very long time. It has fallen so far from its early days, back when Freeze was the whole meta of Genshin Impact. A lot of the most powerful characters throughout its history have been Cryo in the form of Ayaka, Ganyu, Shenhe, and the like. However, Cryo lacks one thing that I feel like is very important in Genshin, and that is very good elemental reactions. While every other element, aside from one, has at least one reaction that is good, it really suffers from this, with its only decent reaction being Melt. Freeze hasn't been useful in a very long time because a lot of enemies just resist CC now, and Superconduct is, well, it's there alright. And then there's obviously the contenders with the universe of mid that is Melt. It's okay, but there are other reactions that are just significantly more powerful than this, and it's hard to ignore the stinker of a lineup that we had all the way up until this point. On top of that, the characters in the Cryo element are just mid. Not saying these characters are bad, but Wriothesley, Ayaka are exactly what I expect to get when I pull a 5-star respectively and nothing more. They don't really break any metrics of measurement in my opinion. They're just okay. They're not bad like a lot of people say, except for Charlotte. I still think she's pretty mid. I know a lot of people say she's good on Farina teams, but people use that same defense for Siege Mean. That doesn't mean she's good. And like I said earlier, people say they're good on Freeze teams, which also aren't good, but who knows? You might want to use a Shatter team comp if that's your type of deal. But speaking of Shatter, Geo is definitely the second worst. Now, I would have said a while ago that Geo was the worst because its reaction is bad, its character lineup is bad, but I think for the longest time Cryo and Geo are kinda competing to who's gonna be the bottom of the dumpster. Matter of fact, the very first video I posted, not even a month ago, was talking about how in my opinion, Geo was the worst element. So what the hell changed? I'll tell you what changed. We've actually gotten other characters. That character being Zillinan. While Cryo as an element suffers from simple lack of reactions and lack of good characters, Geo only suffers from lack of reactions because it has 3 very good characters that come to mind immediately in the form of Navia, Zillinan, and of course Mr. Zhongli. One of the best burst DPSs, one of the best sustains, and one of the best amplifiers for your teams. Now the rest of the Geo roster is unbelievably, unabashedly mid, and that goes for characters like Goro and Arataki Ito. There are a couple niche uses for characters in this list, like of course Yunjin, who is... Wait, Yunjin, that's not right, hold on. Wait, what? It is right. What the fuck? Well, where the fuck? Why did I think that was wrong? Who is good for auto-attack damage-dealing characters. But other than that, the Geo roster isn't really much to talk about. And while I will admit it is no longer the worst element, and I can change my opinions as new information is presented, believe it or not, I still think that overall, it really isn't that great. Obviously, you're competing with Cryo. Trying to debate which dumpster smells worse is not really that fun of a discussion. But what is a fun discussion is discussing the rest of the elements, because I think I'm gonna have a controversial opinion here. Anemo is, in my opinion, one of the bottom elements now, which is fucking crazy, because if you would have asked me 2 years ago, I would have told you that Anemo is one of the best elements. Now, the reason for Anemo not being the top has a lot to do with A, its character roster, and B, its reactions. The only real reaction Anemo has to its name is Swirl, and Swirl is a good reaction, but it's mostly not used as a damaging source, but rather as a way to buff your team with a set like Viridus and Venerer. Anemo also claims use of the crowd control mechanic with the use of characters like Venti, Sucrose, and Kazuha sucking enemies in together and allowing them to deal extra effects, which, don't get me wrong, these are useful, but a lot of enemies, a lot like Freeze's downfall, just simply are immune to CC effects nowadays, which means a lot of teams use Anemo as either a DPS in the form of Zhao and Wanderer, a buffer in the form of a character like Farazan, Kazuha in Cloud Retainer, I don't know her god name, or some kind of iridescent procer. Now, in my opinion, even though Zhao is a good Anemo DPS, I still feel like he'd be better if he was a different element. He's not strong because he's Anemo, he's strong in spite of Anemo. Characters like Farazan are good, but they only buff Zhao and Wanderer. Cloud Retainer is good, and a couple other characters from the list are good, but I feel like nowadays in Genshin, a lot of teams have more unique elemental teams. The days of hyper buffing 1 DPS aren't really around that much anymore. Reaction teams kind of taken hold of the meta. Now, that's not saying Anemo is bad, I still think it's good, it's just, it's kind of outclassed these days. And I really think there's no better example than our good friend Pyro, which in my opinion is next on the list in terms of being the best. Now, Pyro, for the longest time, was one of the biggest benefiters from Anemo because a lot of its characters were hyper carries. Now, as of recent years, this has stopped becoming a thing. For example, Hu Tao used to really want a character on the team to give her some sort of swirl reaction to shred Pyro res, but with the release of Yelan, a lot of Hu Tao teams just ended up becoming Hu Tao, Jingshou, Yelan, and Zhongli. In more recent years, we've seen Pyro dip a lot more out of the hyper vape reaction playstyle and more into reaction-based teams with the introduction of overload-centric gameplay, and with the next version introducing a buff to overload, we can expect to see this even more. Hyper carries of the element have stopped really becoming a thing. Arlecchino's best teams are either overload teams or some sort of hyper investment Pyro Yunlin team, which is a very interesting statement to say out loud. Never thought I'd see the day where vape wasn't considered amazing anymore. And with a lot of characters from Pyro's roster being genuine heavy hitters in most regards, it doesn't take that much effort to see why Pyro is considered one of the best elements in the game. For example, characters in the roster like Bennett, who can buff a lot of teams, and while granted he's not best in slot in some of them anymore, he's still very powerful. Arlecchino, who has one of the highest damage ceilings in the game. Chevreuse, who buffs the overload reaction, making it a hell of a lot stronger. And then there are even some sleeper DPSs who, while not being the top of the charts anymore, are still really powerful, like D-Luke, and obviously Hu Tao, who I've mentioned earlier. I still think Pyro is really good. Unfortunately, I do think there's a couple reasons why Electro is better. Gonna make a quick shout out to Flip, because he's the one who challenged me on this when I said Electro might be one of the worst. With the release of Dendro, Electro is significantly better. It gets use of Hyper Bloom and Aggravate, which have buffed its metrics a ton. On top of that, Overload, like I said earlier, has received a ton of buffs as well, meaning Fire Electric teams are actually kind of valid now. Hyper Bloom teams are some of the most dominating forces in Genshin's meta because it requires such a little amount of investment for a very high ceiling, and while granted, the ceiling isn't as high as other elements, it's still very easy for new players to reach this mark. The only thing I think Electro really doesn't have going for it is its character roster isn't that vast. The only characters I see when I look at the roster that stand out immediately are Kuki Shinobu for Hyper Bloom teams, Fischl for reaction teams in general, Baidu for reasons. I don't really know. She used to be really strong in the old days. I don't really know about how good she is now. Yay Miko, who's just official side grade and in my opinion a worse Fischl. Hell, even characters like Kaching have gotten a lot of use recently. Honestly, looking at it now, Electro kind of has everything. It's got good reactions, it's got a decent character lineup, and it's got some pretty fun teams. It's got a lot of versatility within its roster. The only reason why it's not higher and not breaking the top two is simply because, well, you already know what number one is, and Dendro is just honestly the major reason why Electro is even good to begin with. Dendro gets use of some of the lowest investment and highest damaging teams in the game, in the form of Hyper Bloom, Bloom, Burgeon. With minimal investment in energy recharge, elemental mastery, and of course, a Nahida, you can make some of the most powerful teams in the game that require very little investment, and like I said in my last video, I still feel like the best teams in the game, even though they might not do the most damage, are the teams that can most easily be played and used in the most scenarios. But even if you don't feel like entirely relying on elemental reactions to make your team good, Dendro has a lot of heavy hitters in other regards in the form of Tighnari and Alhaitham, who can make use of teams like Aggravate. Now, Aggravate teams are just amplification reactions that use Electro and Dendro's special properties to increase their damage significantly. And once again, a lot of these teams are just very, very, very low investment, making it very easy for pretty much anybody to make these teams work to begin with. It has everything: powerful reactions, powerful characters, powerful lineup, ease of use. The only reason why it's not higher is because Hydro exists. To the shock and the awe of absolutely zero people in the audience, Hydro is number one. Where do I even start? How about Farina? No, that's not enough. How about Nouvellette? Maybe Jingshou or Yulad. You'll notice something very consistent, and that's that pretty much every team that I've mentioned, or every character that I've mentioned up until this point, wants one of these characters on their team. Hydro is the backbone to pretty much every major powerful reaction in all of Genshin Impact's history. But Hydro, unlike every other element, doesn't need any other element to be powerful. With the introduction of Nouvellette and Farina, Hydro can just absolutely shit on the entire game by itself. Hydro damage, HP percent, crit rate, crit damage. On your Nouvellette right now, congratulations, you have won the entire game. On top of that, Hydro has buffing properties and self-sustaining properties with the use of characters like like, I don't know, Kokomi or Barbara, who are some of the best users of TTDS in the game, healing properties in the form of Farina's secondary skill that nobody ever uses, and her elemental burst being a pretty good buffer, Nuvolette making himself nigh immortal with his elemental balls, and of course, there's just the reactions. You want to make a freeze team? You're gonna have to use Hydro. You want to make a vape team? You're gonna have to use Hydro. You want to use any of the overpowered Dendro core reactions? You're gonna have to use Hydro. Taser? Hydro. It's Hydro's world, and we're just living in it. And if you're surprised that this one's the best one in the game, I don't know what to tell you. That all being said, see ya.